In this segment, we are going to understand the big question of this topic. Now, you all know the Korean War is classified as part of the Cold War. So the question that we always ask ourselves when we study this conflict is not just why it started or how it ended or what happened during the war. Those are more curiosity questions. But the big inquiry question for this topic is, was the Korean War a civil war or a proxy war? To understand this question, we have to first understand the players and where they stood in the Korean conflict. Now, North Korea may have taken the first aggressive action to attack during the Korean War, but they were supported by their big communist brothers, China and the USSR, provided them not just with money and military support, but China even provided soldiers and physically joined them in the war. Now, on the other side, South Korea represented a democratic side, and they were supported by the United Nations and mostly the United States in terms of military aid, financial benefits, as well as even the direction of the conflict and the war was taken by the American General Douglas MacArthur for the huge part of it. And Harry Truman was the one who was directly liaising with the UN troops most of the time. You don't often hear Rhee's name in the narrative of how the South Korean troops were fighting the North Korean troops. So this is something that we need to consider. So when we ask ourselves, was this a civil war or proxy war? You have to ask yourself first, what is a civil war? Now, a civil war is one when two groups of people in one country start fighting. So it's when we are saying that the North Koreans were fighting the South Koreans because this was a conflict of the people and they wanted to unify the country either under democracy or communism. So these people in this country were having a very personal fight for reunification. So that is what we mean when we say civil war. But when we say proxy war, we're trying to say that it's not really that the Korean people themselves wanted so desperately to be together or to have a war, but it was that they ended up being used by the superpowers, USA and USSR, as a way for them to play out the Cold War fight. So this means to say that USA and USSR didn't want to fight each other directly, so they used North and South Korea as pawns in their fight. So the question here now is, was this entire conflict a civil war or a proxy war? So I'm going to summarize for you here the main arguments why we will look back at the Korean crisis and tell ourselves that it was either a civil war or a proxy war. There is no right or wrong answer here, but I'm going to present to you the arguments of both sides and you can decide what you think is best. So there are three big factors why historians often say that the Korean War is largely a civil war. Because there are these three factors that really show that the war was really about North and South Korea fighting to see who would be supreme and reunify the island the way it always was a united Korea. So the first main reason for this was the fact the desire for unification came from North and South Korea. It wasn't Truman or Stalin who went towards Rhee and Kim and told them, hey, you want to start a war? I will support you. There was in no situation that Stalin actually asked Kim if he wanted to start a war. It was always Kim who asked Stalin and Stalin who finally agreed. You must remember this point because at the end of the day, it was not an effort by the superpowers to start a war. It was Kim, in fact, who made several trips to the USSR to persuade Stalin to support North Korea. And in the initial stages, we already know that Stalin said no. So the person who wanted war here was clearly Kim himself and the Korean leaders. We also know about the border skirmishes that were happening between South and North Korea. So Rhee himself was very willing to start a fight in order to reunite his homeland. So you can see here that it was clearly a fight between two leaders fighting for control. Now, we must also recognize the fact that at the start of the war, there were absolutely no Soviet or American troops in the country at all. Now, it would have been so much easier if the Americans had troops in South Korea and the North Koreans had Soviet troops in North Korea. Then it was so easy for them to just use this superpower troops for their benefit. But there were no troops. They had all already left for more than a year before this conflict actually started. So this shows that the superpowers actually had no real intention to get involved in a conflict in Korea. In fact, they thought this entire episode was over, and that was why they left. So you can even see here that eventually when Stalin agreed, he already told Kim that he would never have any direct involvement, but only indirect involvement in terms of money and aid. So you can see reasons why now this was clearly a civil war conflict, because it was between Kim and Ri for their fight to reunify the Korea. Now, these two reasons already show us very clearly why the war in its genesis, or its very beginning, had no roots elsewhere but within the South and North Korean leaders. Now, the further example of this is in the border skirmishes, because this really shows us how there was already so much evidence of the North and South fighting each other without any provocation from the superpowers. Okay, there were warships attacking each other. Okay, there was lots of people who wanted to get rid of Ri, and they were asking Kim to come and take over in the South. There were people in the South who were liaising with their family in the North and wanted to get rid of Kim. So there was lots of already issues between North and South Korea, the people, the leaders. So that is why there's lots of evidence to show that the North and South Koreans themselves really wanted to have a fight to see who would battle it out and become the eventual leader and unifier of Korea. So this is why these three reasons show us very clearly that the conflict in Korea was a civil war. Number one, it was directly started and a result of the desire for reunification from the local leaders. Second of all, that there was limited Soviet and American support. There was no armed forces, nothing in there. And third of all, that there was already lots of instances of conflict even before the Korean War with the border clashes. But, we have to be fair to say that there are lots of also many reasons for us to consider why this could be considered a proxy war. Okay? Now, we all know that the Korean War did not end with just North and South Korea fighting and then just some money was given to North and Korea by USA and USSR. Eventually, we know that the USA through the UN entered the war physically to support South Korea. We also know China, representing the communist cause, entered the war physically to protect its security as well as support its North Korean brothers. So we also have lots of reasons to show why the Korean War could be seen as a proxy war, a proxy of the Cold War tensions between democracy and communism, and Korea was a way for them to fight without directly fighting each other, so it was an indirect conflict. So you might have seen cartoons like this where you see Truman, this is meant to be Truman, and Stalin playing a game of chess. And, in chess, one of the biggest names that we use for the different objects is what we call a pawn. Okay? So was the Korean conflict actually one where it was a pawn? Korea was being made use of by the USA and USSR for their own benefit. You might have also seen this cartoon, which shows a very reluctant North Korean soldier being pushed into the conflict by their big brother, Kim, who seems to be pushed or literally kicked into the conflict by his big brother, Mao, who was being pushed into the conflict by the biggest brother of all, Stalin. I know Stalin looks really Chinese here, I'm not too sure why. But basically, this is something that was also being propagated around that time, that the whole conflict was started actually by the superpowers. So let's look at the reasons in greater detail. Now, the first thing you need to realize was Soviet support for North Korea. All right. Now, Kim, we all know, went to ask Stalin for support. It wasn't Stalin who offered the idea to Kim. Now, when Kim went to speak to Stalin, he went for almost 2 years without any reply from Stalin. And it was only in 1949 that Stalin agreed. Okay? But remember, because Stalin didn't say yes for so long, Kim never did anything. And it was only when Stalin said yes that Kim decided to start the war. So it shows how important Stalin's support was in the Korean conflict. So there would have been no war without Stalin's support. So this shows very clearly that Stalin himself knew this. So why would Stalin agree to it unless he himself was ready to fight the war? So Stalin definitely was not innocent of causing the Korean War. Now, the second thing we need to realize is that unlike USSR, the USA actually kind of physically entered the war. Even though they called themselves the UN troops, more than 80% of the forces were Americans. Okay, they claimed there were 16 countries, but the remaining 15 countries only made up 20% of the armed forces. All right, so Truman knew when he heard of the Korean War and that North Korea had attacked South Korea, he knew that he had to intervene. Okay, but he did not want a direct confrontation. All right, because he knew this could lead to nuclear war and other more dangerous things. So he had to find a different way to actually start the war. But he knew for a fact that they had to act and they couldn't just, have sanctions or wait for the North and South Koreans to end the conflict themselves. He was too worried that South Korea would also fall to the communists. So that was why he was very aggressive in pushing for the UN to join the war, so that this would give it an excuse, that as if it was the UN who was protecting their member South Korea and not the US who was being kaypoh and trying to support its South Korean ally. So here, what you need to realize is USA really played the system to their benefit. They used the session when USSR was not present, so there would have been no one to say no to the idea. Okay, and the minute the UN agreed, they immediately decided to put an American soldier as the leader, General MacArthur. Okay, and it was President Truman who was now giving all the instructions. Okay, so what we see here was that it was the USA who clearly wanted to join the war. And they were not going to give up until some explicit help was given to South Korea. They were not going to let it loose. Okay, you think about it. At the point in July when the UN was asked to join, basically North Korea had taken over almost all of South Korea except for one tiny part, which was Busan. Okay, so it would have been very easy to just admit defeat, but Truman was not going to go down without a fight. So he used any way possible to join the fight. Now, the third thing you need to realize here is the entry of China. Even though USSR never physically joined the war, all right, we know that they had already had an agreement with China that China would be the one to support North Korea as a communist brother in this conflict. All right. Now, even though the Chinese say that they entered the war because of the UN forces crossing the Yalu River, history has shown us that they had already started crossing soldiers even before this particular incident happened. In mid-October, they were already crossing soldiers, even though MacArthur only crossed the Yalu River in November. Okay, so you see here that already 1 month in advance, the Chinese were already prepared to join the war and they were making plans to join the war. Okay, so what you understand here now is that clearly this was definitely a Cold War conflict of communism versus democracy. It wasn't just by the way, we are communists versus democratic forces. It was, yes, we are communism versus democracy and we want to fight for our ideals. And China was fighting on behalf of its big Soviet brother to support North Korea. Okay, now the last point is something that I think we cannot ignore at all. It's very strange that this entire conflict, we all know, started with North Korea attacking South Korea. It was Kim who went to Stalin who asked for support. Okay, we know that this was how it started. But isn't it really interesting that it ended with the superpowers? Now, that's really weird, right? If two brothers had a fight, why is it that it's the parents that are deciding what to do? That doesn't make sense at all, unless it was the parents who started something secretly. So we need to look at this from a different perspective as well to understand that even during the discussions for peace, North and South Korea wanted to continue fighting. Okay, they had new strategies and they wanted to fight to the death to see who would eventually win. All right. Kim wanted to unify, Rhee wanted to push past the Yalu River. Okay, but all of this was ignored. Okay, they were completely ignored by the superpowers. The superpowers were more concerned that they wanted to end the conflict. It was getting too expensive. They were worried about a global war. And they didn't care really about the welfare of what the North and South Korean people wanted for their country. If it was really a civil war, shouldn't the people have been represented? Shouldn't their views have been considered? and something be done for them. But this was not at all present during the conflict. So if you put together the reasons for the civil war and reasons why it could be a proxy war, you have to ask yourself which seems more persuasive to you. Now, what I would like to suggest, or for you to think about, is that the factors on this side of the table of why it's a civil war seem to date in the early 1950s. Whereas if you look at the rest of the reasons, it shows that how the war developed such that it became one that involves superpowers, and that it ended also with superpowers. So one hypothesis that some historians that I also subscribe to is that it started as a civil war, but it grew to become a proxy war. The Soviets and the Americans saw a great opportunity here to push their agenda, and that was what they actually did. So yes, there is elements of this particular conflict being a civil war because its roots, genesis, and problems started from there. But let's not ignore the facts that it was really a proxy war, and a huge part of how the Cold War was developing in outside of Europe, with other countries that were getting drawn into the communist versus democratic fight. Okay, so keep these factors in mind when you are considering whether this is a civil war or proxy war. This is a very popular question for source base. So when you get a question like this, you would have to look at sources and ask yourself, does this source tell me that it's a civil war or proxy war? And you have to divide the sources based on their arguments. All right. This is also a very rich essay topic. So that's why I have listed the points in this way as well. For NA students, you will often be asked to list the reasons. For Express students, you will often have to weigh and come up with a conclusion. So this is one possible conclusion you could give, where you resolve both the civil war aspects and proxy war aspects of the Korean War. I hope this clarifies the significance of the Korean conflict to the Cold War, and you will be more aware of how the Korean War can be perceived and is remembered in history. Once again, speak to your teachers if you have questions, or always just comment on this video if you have any other areas you would like me to touch on. Thank you.